The story of Moses is that of a people leaving oppression and slavery behind in order to enter a land promised to them by their God. And as they enter that land, they'll bring with them a religion similar to that practiced in Judah, but also distinct. That distinction is what gives them the authority of conquest, the right to be the sole inhabitants of an already populated nation. This story finds its parallel in the post-exilic conflict in which the returned exiles lay claim to the land and reject the older cult and its practices. Their differences, they argue, grant them sole ownership of the nation, and those who cling to the old ways are not only wicked, but their style of worship is directly responsible for the destruction of Jerusalem. And these parallels might not be coincidental. One story may very well have been written to lend credence to the other. I'm your host, Jason, and you're listening to Dragons and Genesis. In the last episode, we covered the first 13 chapters of Jeremiah, so we'll be picking up right where we left off. Jeremiah is comprised of 52 chapters, and the first 25 of them make up the core of this book. Chapters 14 and 15 present us with a lament psalm similar to that seen in chapter 12 in the previous episode. Yahweh has made his decision to destroy the nation of Judah in earlier chapters, and even prohibited the prophet Jeremiah from attempting to intercede on the nation's behalf, as we saw in chapter 11. The city of Jerusalem lets out a cry that rises up to heaven as it suffers from drought, resulting in thirsty nobles and empty jars. The cisterns are also empty and the soil is ruined. Farmers, deer, donkeys, and jackals all join in the lament. Their song admits their guilt, which is the cause of their suffering, and places its hope and salvation in Yahweh. For those of you who have listened to the Psalm episodes, these traits will be familiar to you as notable features of the lament psalms. They rhetorically ask why Yahweh should be like a stranger in their land who stops in only for a night. They remind Yahweh that they bear his name and ask that he remember them. This mention of bearing the name of Yahweh could be a reference to people using theophoric names that include the name of Yahweh, or it could also be a reference to the wearing of Yahweh's name on the forehead during the Day of Atonement celebration. Despite their pleas, their petition is ignored and rejected in verse 10, as Yahweh proclaims that he shall remember their guilt and punish them for their sins. Jeremiah is once again told not to intercede on behalf of the population. Their fasting, sacrifices, and prayers will all be ignored as Yahweh destroys his people with war, famine, and plague. Their fate is sealed, and there's no changing his mind. Worse yet, the prophets of Yahweh speak lies in the name of Yahweh, giving false prophecy and resorting to prohibited methods of divination in order to deceive the people. The lying prophets will be slain along with their families, and none shall mourn or bury them. Another lament begins in verse 17, though it's presented as the words that Jeremiah is meant to speak to the people on behalf of Yahweh. He weeps for the destruction that will befall the city and surrounding countryside. People slain by the sword and famine lie upon the ground, and corrupt priests speak falsely. Judah has been condemned because Yahweh sees the city of Zion as loathsome, so he sends terror while they pray for peace. They beg Yahweh to not break his covenant with them, but he will remember the sins of their ancestors who wronged him. Finally, at the end of the psalm and the end of this chapter, they rhetorically ask if there are any other gods that can bring rain, a not-so-subtle reminder that Yahweh is a weather deity. We're reminded that he alone can do this thing, and that the city and the land so desperately need it. So the chapter is equating drought with the impending destruction of Jerusalem. Or perhaps a better way to put it is that the Babylonian conquest is being envisioned as a drought, the weather phenomenon being used as symbolism for the war and wrath of Yahweh, fitting as he is a god of storm and war. Chapter 15 again launches into an intercession on behalf of the people. Yahweh states that even if Moses and Samuel spoke out before him, he still wouldn't turn back toward the people. Those who are doomed to death shall die. Some are marked for the sword, some for famine, and others for captivity. And to those fates they shall go. They'll be killed by the sword, dragged away by dogs, fed upon by birds, and generally made to be an example of horror to the rest of the world. Yahweh starts singing about the judgment coming to the land in verse 5 as he rhetorically asks who will pity Jerusalem or ask about its welfare. The city has disowned Yahweh, and so he'll bring upon them a great winnowing as he turns a destroying hand toward them. He'll kill so many of them that the widows of Judah will be more numerous than the sands of the sea. Compare this with the promise of prosperity to Abraham, when Yahweh tells the patriarch that his descendants will be more numerous than the stars of the sky. In the latter half of the chapter, Jeremiah laments his station as a prophet. He struggles to serve Yahweh and spread his word to the people, but the message is poorly received and they detest him, a reference to the plots against Jeremiah and the strife with the temple priest. He wishes to intercede on behalf of the people, but they still suffer misfortune and anguish, and their sins ultimately lead to their captivity. They become slaves to their enemies in a foreign land. Jeremiah reminds Yahweh that he's a deity that is slow to anger, and he asks for mercy from the people's persecutors. By this point, you should recognize that this isn't really the words of a prophet, but another lament psalm. This particular psalm works a bit better in context than most of the others that we've found in Isaiah and Jeremiah. It fits the theme of Jeremiah attempting to convince the people to return to Yahweh, only to then find himself mistreated by his own listeners. Of course, this psalm isn't about Jeremiah or his life, but about the anonymous singers who belt out these psalms during worship. They are the ones who devoured Yahweh's words, yet their pain is unrelenting. Yahweh offers to take them back into his presence, a line that doesn't make sense if this is Jeremiah speaking, but it fits well if it's a lament psalm meant to be sung by a desperate congregation. The psalm ends with a promise to make the people into a wall of bronze against whom their enemies will not prevail. Chapter 16 begins with Yahweh offering some unsolicited advice, which comes in the form of him instructing the people of Jerusalem to not get married or have children in the city, because it has no future. Famine, disease, and war will soon sweep the land and leave bodies piled in the streets, an allusion to the state of the city following its destruction at the hands of the Babylonians. He also instructs them to not bother mourning for the dead, because their fate just happens to be his will. He has withdrawn his peace from them, a reference to Yahweh's protection being like a divine shield, similar to the Aegis from Greek mythology. The land, like its people, will die and go unmourned by the world because he has decided to silence the land of Judah. And if the people ask why this was done, Jeremiah is to reiterate that the reason is their ancestors' abandonment of Yahweh. Another indication that these oracles are an argument against the native religion of Judah. Instead, the residents of Jerusalem should follow the new religion and covenant, which has come with the released slaves from Babylon. The next oracle begins in verse 14 and promises a conclusion to their exile and a return to Jerusalem. These oracles are written in the post-exilic period, of course, but they're presented as a message of hope for those who fear destruction. From the destruction of Jerusalem comes the hope of restoration, and it's phrased as a repeat of the transference of land to their ancestors. Essentially, the post-exilic authors are bringing people into the land of Judah and introducing religious reforms that clash with the native practices. To encourage their adherents to maintain this theology, they frame their current situation as a repeat of an ancient invasion, that of Abraham, who famously migrated from the same area, Babylon, to Israel. And the destruction of Jerusalem is used as a cautionary tale of what happens to those who fail to obey the land deal struck between Yahweh and these new inhabitants. Yahweh's wrath against the nation comes in the form of a foreign enemy, depicted in verse 16 as hunters and fishermen. This is in contrast to the national leaders who are depicted as shepherds. No longer are they here to protect and guide, but to hunt and harvest the people. The land has been profaned by the presence of idols and polytheism. The chapter ends with an outline of what nations must do in order to feel the protection that Yahweh has withdrawn from Judah. He offers strength and safety in their time of distress, but people craft false gods to serve. They confess their idolatry, and in turn Yahweh will offer them knowledge which they must accept, and through this acceptance they shall learn Yahweh's true name. In previous episodes, especially those concerning the Book of Enoch, we've discussed the idea that the deeds of people and nations are recorded on tablets in heaven, and those deeds are used in the heavenly courtroom to enact judgment and to determine the fate of a person following their death. This tidbit of mythology is largely omitted from modern religion, as the idea that God is omniscient has taken hold. But in the ancient world, Yahweh still needed a reminder of what a person did during their lifetime in order to judge them justly. The beginning of chapter 17 preserves a bit of this ancient idea and provides further details that weren't mentioned in the Book of Enoch. Yahweh's stylus, according to the opening verse, is made of iron and tipped with diamond. And it's this stylus he uses to inscribe the deeds of the nation of Judah. These tools weren't pens, but functioned in a similar manner. Rather than dipping in ink and writing on paper, these were used to scratch letters into wax or clay tablets. These tablets were comprised of a wooden frame and coated with wax or clay. One could write in them with a stylus, and then the tablet could be closed like a book and delivered to the recipient. To send a reply, one would warm the wax or smooth out the clay, thus erasing the words. Then they could inscribe their own message and send the tablet back. This is the technology envisioned in heaven: wax or clay tablets with an iron stylus. I think they've upgraded to some sort of digital record keeping by now, with Facebook reporting your violations and Yahweh's angels using algorithms to determine your fate. They still use a tablet, but it's probably an iPad. Back to Jeremiah. Judah is reminded of the sins of the people, using Asherah poles, hilltop shrines, and sacred groves for worship. This has led to their punishment, the looting which is seen throughout the territory, and the capture of their ancestral land, along with their enslavement. This has been done to them because their sin has enkindled anger in Yahweh that burns like a fierce and consuming fire. The topic shifts to wisdom in verse 5, and if you've listened to the previous episodes where this topic is discussed, you won't be surprised when Yahweh warns against trusting to human understanding instead of the wisdom of the Lord. Those who do have merely turned from Yahweh and will become like a barren wasteland. Of course, wisdom can't be discussed without contrasting the wicked with the wise, so we see Yahweh blessing those who trust in His wisdom, and likening them to a tree planted beside a stream, the exact opposite of how the man who turns from Yahweh is portrayed. Men are judged according to the contents of their hearts and rewarded accordingly, so those who are currently suffering must have done something to earn their punishment. Your own heart can mislead you, which in turn causes your own suffering, so it's best to simply follow Yahweh. This is to encourage simple obedience of the temple priests and prophets. Their holy place, meaning the temple in Jerusalem, is exalted as Yahweh's throne and the source of the living waters that nourish the whole of the earth, and its residents look to a future time when their enemies will be put to shame and cast down into the underworld for forsaking their patron deity. To this end, they pray for vengeance on their enemies and deliverance for themselves. Hopefully, in His anger, Yahweh will not also become a terror to them, but only to their persecutors. Chapter 17 ends with a sermon on keeping the Sabbath, presented predictably as the way of wisdom and the way of folly. See episodes 77 through 79, the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes episodes, for more information on that topic. Here, the path of wisdom is keeping the Sabbath, while the path of folly is breaking the Sabbath. As expected, the two are contrasted as the rules of the Sabbath are laid out. One shouldn't carry heavy burdens or participate in any work. If the people will keep the Sabbath and obey Yahweh's commands, then the city will be inhabited forever, and the kings and princes will march through its gates, and sacrifices will continue to be offered. But should you break the Sabbath and fail to obey Yahweh's commands, then He will set fire to the gates and consume the palaces of the city. Chapter 18 begins with the oracle of the potter's vessel. The message of this oracle is that Yahweh possesses both the ability to create and destroy, according to the obedience of the people. Jeremiah is instructed to go down to the potter's house, and there he will hear the word of Yahweh. Though I should point out that he's listening to Yahweh's instructions, so maybe the trip to the potter's house isn't actually needed. Anyway, while there, he observes the potter working at his little spinning pottery wheel thingy and saw that the first pot turned out wonky, so he made another that was better. Now that Jeremiah has seen this with his own eyes, Yahweh can then use it as an example of what he intends to do with his favorite people. They went bad, which upset him, so now he's going to remake them as a better version of themselves. Though one could argue that the potter should have paid better attention with the first vessel and not made a mistake, but we'll let that one slide. So he's going to fashion an evil to destroy them and cause the rest to turn from their evil ways. And what evil ways are they guilty of? Unnatural apostasy, which is both the title of the next oracle and a great name for a heavy metal band. Yahweh chastises Israel for doing despicable things, the likes of which are unheard of among the nations. The rivers never dry up, nor do the snowy peaks go bare, but the people of Israel have abandoned their God, meaning that nature is being obedient and doing what it's supposed to, but the nation of Israel is not. And for this he'll scatter them and bring disaster to their land. Beginning in verse 18, we have Jeremiah facing challenges at home as his opponents plot against him. So he prays to Yahweh that his good deeds are not punished with their evil, and reminds Yahweh that he has stood on behalf of the people who now betray him. Rather than beg for their deliverance as he had in the past, Jeremiah now asks Yahweh to give their children to famine, and let the husbands die of pestilence, leaving their wives as widows, and the other children to be struck down in battle. The prophet wants their homes plundered and their crimes to never be forgiven. And since these words, which are a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, were written generations later, the author isn't recounting what happened to any prophet and what favors he asked of Yahweh. Instead, he's penning a polemic against those who reject the prophets in his own time, by equating them to those who caused the destruction of Judah. We return to the potter in chapter 19 with the oracle of the symbol of the potter's flask. This is Yahweh's response to Jeremiah's earlier petition. The prophet is to purchase a flask from the potter and go to a particular gate in Jerusalem to speak Yahweh's words. The god intends to bring great evil upon the people of the city for the sin of forsaking their patron deity. They built altars to Baal and offered sacrifices on hilltop shrines. But days are coming when the Topheth is no longer called the Topheth or the Hinnom Valley, but rather the Valley of Slaughter. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's recycled from the end of chapter 7, which we covered in the previous episode. He will use the swords of the enemies to slaughter the people of Judah and give their corpses to the birds and the beasts as food, to serve as a horrific reminder to passers-by how vengeful Yahweh can truly be. And how bad can he be? In verse 9, he says he will make the people eat the flesh of their own children during the siege. Jeremiah is then told to smash the potter's flask in sight of the crowd and tell them that the same will be done to them by Yahweh. And if this scene sounds familiar, it's a parallel to Moses smashing the tablets before the Israelites are punished for the same sin mentioned here, improper worship and following the other gods of heaven. So the evil mentioned by Yahweh will be delivered to the people, because they have become stubborn and refuse to obey Yahweh's words. All this doom and gloom from Jeremiah earned him a sharp rebuke from Pashur, the priest, who struck the prophet and tossed him in the stocks to chill out for 24 hours. Upon his release, Jeremiah demonstrated that he indeed had not learned his lesson and immediately issued another prophetic warning, this time directed at Pashur. He told the priest that Yahweh would hand over Pashur and all of his friends to the terror that he had stirred up against the nation, where he would see them fall by the sword of their enemies. Then all that remained of Judah would be given to the king of Babylon, and its wealth would be taken as plunder. As for Pashur himself, he and his family would be carried off into exile, where he would eventually die and be buried, because his prophecies were false. We then turn to Jeremiah's own thoughts as he realizes he has been tricked by Yahweh into becoming a prophet, a task he hoped to avoid, just as Moses likewise wished to sidestep his own duties. But Yahweh was too compelling, and against him none could stand. So Jeremiah is now a prophet, but his words have made him enemies, and all the people mock him for preaching Yahweh's message. He even tries to hold back the words and avoid speaking Yahweh's name, but again he is unable. Even his friends turned against him and wish him harm, but he's under Yahweh's protection, and his persecutors are the ones who falter, not the prophet. He still curses the day he was born and laments that he wasn't killed in the womb. The entire section echoes the laments found in the book of Job. See episodes 72 and 73. The poem ends when he sees the sorrow and pain that is the end of the nation of Israel. The core of Jeremiah ends with a collection called The Oracles in the Last Years of Jerusalem, which comprises chapters 21 to 25. This section begins with an oracle concerning the fate of King Zedekiah and the city of Jerusalem. Jeremiah was to ask Yahweh for assistance because King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was attacking the city. The hope was that Yahweh would cause the invading army to withdraw, and Jeremiah could intercede on behalf of the city. But Yahweh has not only decided to send Babylon against the city to besiege them, but also to fight against the city himself. So Yahweh is fighting on behalf of the Babylonians to strike down the inhabitants of the city of Jerusalem without mercy. The only escape is to surrender to Babylon and go into captivity. Zedekiah anticipates a miracle, perhaps like the one under Hezekiah when the Assyrians threatened Jerusalem in Isaiah 36 and 37. But it doesn't come, because Yahweh has decided to treat the city with evil instead of good. Something of note here is in verse 5 when Yahweh declares he will fight against the city with outstretched hand and a mighty arm, which echoes the stories from Exodus and the Israelite conquest of Canaan, when Yahweh fought for, not against, the community. Jeremiah, as a sort of reverse Moses, is a common theme in these books. They serve the same number of years. Jeremiah leads the people from Israel to Egypt just as Moses travels in the opposite direction. Both are reluctant to serve as Yahweh's messenger, and so on. Beginning in verse 11, we have a collection of oracles written against the Judean monarchy. This collection covers the rest of chapters 21, all of 22, and concludes with verse 8 of chapter 23. Most of this section is addressed to the royal house, and even to specific kings, though there are exceptions, such as predictions of the restoration following the exile in chapter 23, and two addressed to the city of Jerusalem, where she's personified as a goddess in 21:13-14 and 22:20-23. The royal house of Judah is instructed by Yahweh to dispense justice and to rescue the oppressed. These are traits of the ideal king, a just ruler and protector of the weak. Ignoring these instructions will prompt the patron deity to unleash his fury like an unquenchable flame to punish their evil. He states that he stands against the ruler of the valley, the rock of the plain. These are names for Jerusalem, a city surrounded by valleys and has thick walls that are difficult to breach. The people can't imagine anyone who could penetrate those walls, but Yahweh promises that he can send someone against the city who will devour them. Jeremiah is instructed in chapter 22 to visit the king of Judah and deliver the word of Yahweh to his ears. He should do what is right to rescue the victims from their oppressors, protect the resident aliens, orphans, and widows, and never shed innocent blood. Again, this is the behavior of the righteous king. If the king does as commanded, then the royal line of David will be preserved well into the future, but disobedience will lead to ruin, and their house shall become like rubble. He will turn Judah into a wasteland with empty cities. Enemies will be sent against them to destroy and to burn. Judah will then serve as an example to the other nations of the horrors Yahweh can inflict on people who choose to break his covenant and serve other gods. There's no point weeping for the dead. Instead, one should weep for the living who are carried off to Babylon, never to be seen again. This is the fate of those who force their neighbors to work without pay and take advantage of others. They may believe they're improving their own lot, but in reality they're sealing their own fate. Those who prosper at the expense of the poor will be punished. An interesting side note is this is the third excuse we've seen in this episode for the destruction of Jerusalem. The first being the worship of other gods, the second being breaking the Sabbath, and the third being an unrighteous king and mistreating the poor. Their flocks will be scattered, and their lovers exiled because of their wickedness, and they shall groan like a woman in childbirth. They'll be handed over to their enemies, Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon. They shall be like a broken vessel that no one wants. A return to the imagery seen earlier in which the fate of Judah was likened to a broken piece of pottery. After chastising corrupt kings for their behavior and warning against such missteps, the oracle turns to the promise of the just shepherds, who will one day be raised up to lead the people and show them they no longer have to fear. Chapter 23 starts by condemning the unjust shepherds who misled the people and scattered them, driving them away from Yahweh through improper worship. This lays the blame of the Babylonian conquest squarely at the feet of rival priests and prophets, showing once again that this is a theological argument at its core. In verses 5 and 6, we see a poem about a righteous branch of David that will be raised up to reign and govern wisely, to serve as a just ruler of the land, and in those days he shall save Judah, and the land will dwell in security. Though this oracle is written to provide support for Governor Zerubbabel and the other Persian-affiliated rulers of Jerusalem in later decades, it will eventually be recycled as a prophecy about the Messiah, when the political situation surrounding Jerusalem under the Romans mirrors that of the situation under Babylon. They express hope for the people of Judah to be restored to their land after their banishment. Following this is a denunciation of false prophets, reiterating the theological argument at the root of these prophetic texts. Along with unjust kings, false prophets likewise led to the downfall of Judah according to this section of the chapter. The crimes of these prophets are many, and the presence of these false prophets is likened to the land being filled with adulterers. Recall from previous episodes that worshiping other gods and even idols of Yahweh was likened to adultery. These priests and prophets are called godless and wicked. They have corrupted the house of Yahweh, meaning the Jerusalem temple is host to improper worship, another indication that later priests took issue with the original style of worship in Jerusalem. We discussed this in episodes covering Ezra and Nehemiah, c. 68 and 70. This improper worship practiced by the older cult is compared to slippery ground that shall lead into darkness and disaster, similar to Sodom and Gomorrah. For their sin of idolatry and misleading Yahweh's people, he will poison their drink and give them wormwood to eat. He then tells the people to cease listening to the words of such prophets, revealing that they're still active in their post-exilic period when these oracles were written. Their prophecies are said to be of their own imagination and not true prophecy. This is the typical argument that arises from denominational disputes. Each group within a religion accuses the others of being false and preaching fabrications, while simultaneously claiming that their ideas are divinely inspired. This is how you end up with thousands of denominations within a single religion. The prophet contrasts the grim fate of the false priests by offering promises of security to those who follow his own message. Those who trust in the true prophecy shall never succumb to evil and will always know peace. Meanwhile, the wicked will be overcome by a whirling storm from Yahweh, giving us yet another example of the deity's association with storm god imagery. Yahweh asks if the hearts of these false prophets will ever turn back to him. a backhanded offering for post-exilic adherents of the ancient cult to get on the right path by switching to the new religion, by speaking truth, meaning they must accept the message presented by newer prophets. They condemn the older worship, and those prophets who still present prophecies which support it must abandon their message and fall in line with the Reformed religion. This, according to verse 27, is associated with Baal, as this was an older title for Yahweh, as seen in Hosea 2:16-17. The older cult is now considered a burden to Yahweh, which inspires him to punish their families for their inconvenience of him and cast them from his presence and shame them forever. Chapter 24 gives us the oracle of the 2 baskets of figs, which contrast 2 Jewish communities divided along political and theological lines. The bad figs are those who rebelled against Babylon, who represent the First Temple cult and their religious practices, which are now seen as wicked. The good figs are those who now reside in Babylon and are loyal to the empire, the exiles and their descendants who journeyed to Judah under Zerubbabel and Ezra, and brought with them a new style of worship which carried Babylonian and Persian influence, and are the true heirs of the restored city. It begins with Yahweh showing Jeremiah 2 baskets of figs, which would prompt me into a feeding frenzy, and now I need to go check on my fig trees before the birds steal them all. Anyway, these baskets are placed before the Jerusalem temple. One basket, predictably, contains tasty figs that ripened early, while the other basket contained rotten figs which couldn't be eaten. Yahweh explained that he would regard the exiles who had been taken away to Babylon in the same manner that Jeremiah regarded the basket of good figs. They would be looked after and taken care of, and their trees never uprooted or torn down, and they would remain loyal to Yahweh. They shall be his people, and Yahweh shall be their God. As for the rotten figs, the remnant of Jerusalem that remains in the land, those native groups who practice the older style of worship not influenced by Babylon and Persia, they will be made an example of for all the nations to see, a horror and a curse. They'll be afflicted by sword, famine, and pestilence until they have all disappeared. This polemic is useful in the post-exilic period, as it rejects the idea that the native population has any right to exist. Only those descended from the exilic population can rightfully exist in Judah and Israel, a claim likewise made in the Deuteronomic material. This oracle will be used in Mark 11 when the new Christian cult judges the Second Temple cult in the same way that the Second Temple cult here judges the First Temple. Jesus compares the Second Temple to the rejected figs, whose time of judgment has come. In that scene, he comes upon the fig trees before their season, and judges them for not yet producing fruit. That is because here in Jeremiah 24, the good figs are produced early, according to verse 2. Since the fig trees outside of Jerusalem hadn't produced figs early, they were among those that Yahweh had rejected. Chapter 25 serves as a summary for the core of Jeremiah, this first section of the book. It presents the people's opinion as one of general refusal to listen to the prophecies delivered by Jeremiah, and their refusal to accept them as the word of Yahweh. Judah's fate and destruction is now sealed, and the prophet's intervention cannot dissuade Yahweh from his decision to destroy the land and its cities. Some remnant of the population will be exiled for 70 years, a biblical lifetime, according to Psalm 90, verse 10. Once this time is past, Yahweh's agent, the nation of Babylon, will then suffer the same fate he afflicted upon Judah. The ostensible dating for this chapter is set in 605 BCE, the 4th year of Jehoiakim's reign, though the mention of the Babylonian exile and its conclusion reveals the composition to originate from a much later date. Jeremiah addresses all the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem, presumably through a mass email or a live stream. In this address before the entire nation, he reminds the people that they have consistently refused to listen to his words. Yet they're all gathered around listening to his words. Yeah, I don't get it either. For 23 years, he's gathered all the people together, and they keep gathering, yet somehow they all refuse to hear him, and he's growing tired of it. He warns them all to turn away from their evil deeds, and if they do, they'll be allowed to remain in the land which Yahweh gave over to their ancestors. They're instructed to not follow or worship other gods, lest they provoke Yahweh into action. However, despite his many warnings, they refuse to listen, so now Yahweh is sending a great evil from the north, and that evil is named Nebuchadnezzar. I wonder how Nebuchadnezzar felt about being called a great evil. With a name like Nebuchadnezzar, he probably thought it was pretty rad. Jeremiah's mission during the prior decades was to sway the populace into following Yahweh through an acceptable form of worship. But he failed in that mission, and so the nation will now suffer for their refusal to obey. The author then accidentally slips up in verse 13 and says, "Against this land I will fulfill all the words I have spoken against it, all that is written in this book, which Jeremiah prophesied against all the nations." Wait, I thought this was being spoken aloud to the residents of Judah, but here it says it's a collection of oracles being written in a book. And it mentions Jeremiah in the third person, so our author is very much not Jeremiah the prophet, but someone claiming to write on his behalf. Those pesky editors always overlook something. In verse 15, the cup of Yahweh's wrath is administered to the nation. It's filled with bitter wine and given to the people to drink to make them sick, causing them to retch. The kings and princes and all the people and all the cities are made a ruin and a waste, along with a host of other nations Yahweh has decreed are impure, such as Edom, Moab, and Egypt, just to name a few. They're all to drink and vomit, to fall over sick, never again to rise, and to be cut down by the sword that he sends among them as he inflicts evil upon his people. We're treated to another poem in verse 30, which depicts Yahweh as a wicked tyrannical king who roars from his mountaintop palace as he rages at the people of the earth before administering judgment upon them. He stalks through the nations as a vengeful spirit of disaster, raging like a violent storm god. The slain shall not be mourned nor buried. They'll instead lie like dung on the ground, strewn from one end of the earth to the other. Shepherds shall howl as their flocks are slain, and then the shepherds too shall be cut and slaughtered. Such is the burning wrath of Yahweh. So we see here the deity is portrayed as both a storm god and a fire god, reinforcing the Topheth imagery and Baal parallels seen in earlier episodes. The whole of the earth shall sing a great song of mourning as the people are judged and slain. And on that cheerful note, we bring the core of Jeremiah and this pleasant and uplifting episode to a close. You can avoid Yahweh's wrath by giving a review on your favorite podcast app or by heading over to dragonsandgenesis.com, where you can find links to donate, join my Patreon, send books from my wish list, and find a list of recommended reading, and get information on the latest episodes. And as always, thank you for listening.